Hey guys, I'm Mnar Muhawesh and welcome again to another episode of MintPress News' Behind the Headline. We're a citizen-led project created in partnership with Free Speech TV. This show is made possible by viewers like you, so to learn more about our citizen supporters and conscious business partners, visit our website at mintpressnews.com. Now let's get behind the headline. As President Barack Obama reaches the final stages of his presidency, for the general public, he will most likely be remembered for denuclearizing Iran and opening the door back up to Cuba. But will the Drone King also be remembered for normalizing targeted killings as a pillar of U.S. counter-terror policy? Well, on his third day in office, Obama authorized 2 drone strikes in Pakistan, killing over a dozen civilians. It set the tone for an administration that's killed thousands by weaponized unmanned aerial vehicles, the vast majority of whom did nothing to deserve their fate except for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The vast majority of whom the U.S. fails to recognize as victims in the ever-expanding war on terror. Perhaps that's why when it was announced in October 2009 that Obama would be the year's recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, the president himself said he was surprised and felt undeserving of the award. After all, he'd been in office for less than a year, and in that year, the U.S. was fighting 2 wars. Most of the Nobel Committee's consideration of the Green President revolved on campaign promises of helping to build a more peaceful world by scaling down U.S. militarism. Promises distilled into 2 words: change and hope. Now let's go look back at those first 2 drone strikes, though, on January 23, 2009. The first CIA drone strike flattened an entire house. Now, despite initial reports that the attack was a success, killing as many as 10 militants, including foreign fighters, and possibly even a high-value target, later reports revealed something else: that at least 9 civilians were killed. The lone survivor, Fahim Qureshi, suffered severe injuries, shrapnel wounds in his abdomen, a fractured skull, and he lost an eye. He was 14. Now, the second drone strike of the day killed 5 to 10 people. Again, all civilians. This loss of innocent human life didn't deter the Nobel Peace Prize winner from continuing to authorize drone strikes throughout both terms of his presidency. And even today, weaponized drones continue to rain down death and destruction as part of the CIA efforts or other covert operations. These attacks are taking place today, most notably in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, and Afghanistan. Through coalition airstrikes have occurred in Iraq and Syria as well. Now, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism maintains an active database of reported drone strikes and casualties in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan. The Bureau's figures largely come from news sources and NGOs operating in these countries, not the official government figures that grossly misrepresent the deaths of civilians as enemies killed in action. Now, since 2004, according to the Bureau, Pakistan has been hit the most with drones, an astounding 423. The vast majority of those strikes were authorized not by W, who first got the drone program off the ground, but by the Nobel laureate himself, President Obama. In fact, the Bureau notes most strikes were launched during President Obama's first year in office than during both terms of the Bush presidency. Not quite the change and hope voters were hoping. According to Pitch Interactive, of the 3,341 people who have been killed in drone strikes in Pakistan since 2004, less than 2% of the victims are high-profile targets. The rest are civilians, children, and alleged combatants. Now, The Intercept provides an even more damning indictment of Obama's drone program in its series called The Drone Papers. And in Jeremy Scahill's recent book called The Assassination Complex, Scahill's team at The Intercept analyzed classified documents provided to the organization by a whistleblower who exposed the inner workings of Obama's drone wars. Those documents highlight the program's expansion of unconventional warfare, both on and off declared battlefields, as well as an alarming lack of transparency and due process. Now, drones, Scahill writes, are a tool, not a policy. The policy is assassination. Indeed, the horrifying reality is that in this system devoid of transparency and accountability, Innocent civilians are dying in far higher numbers than the imminent threats the drones are supposed to be targeting. The leaked documents, which cover Operation Haymaker in northeastern Afghanistan, reveal that during one 5-month period of the operation, nearly 90% of the people killed in airstrikes were not the intended targets. And the ratios may be much higher in Yemen and Somalia, where intelligence is more limited. Speaking to Shatterproof's Kevin Gatsala, Scale explained the dehumanizing way in which drones seek and destroy their targets.
The source for the drone papers who had worked on these high-value targeting campaigns, as the Obama administration likes to call it, really described a kind of sickening system where there was a cavalier attitude about anyone who was around the cell phone of someone that they believed to be a terrorist. Because the way that the overwhelming number of cases where people are being killed in drone strikes, it's not that you're killing people, it's that you're blowing up a phone that you believe to be held by the person that you are hunting. And many drone operators and people who work on these targeting platforms never even know the actual name of the person that they're targeting. They're either given a designation like, Sandbox 1, Sandbox 2, and those are describing the SIM card or the phone that they have. And then they're given just a number on the screen, and so they know that they are tracking this series of numbers. And it's a way of dehumanizing the enemy.
Now, in addition to being completely dehumanizing, Obama's drone wars rely on unreliable data and metadata, something even the Intelligence Surveillance Task Force, a Pentagon entity, has acknowledged. Now, in a 2013 secret report leaked to The Intercept, the ISR stated bluntly, kill operations significantly reduce the intelligence available. Now, aside from the obvious failings in intelligence, and without even broaching the morality of targeted killing campaigns, the drone wars operate in a hazy legal context. In 2013, Obama put forth policy guidelines that were theoretically meant to stop or at least curtail the use of drones. But as Trevor Tim wrote for The Guardian last year, it has become increasingly clear that the rules are virtually meaningless, and the Obama administration is setting a terrifying precedent for the next president who can change or expand them on a whim. Now you're probably thinking, okay, but drone strikes must at least be conducted within the framework of international law. Well, actually, they're also in contravention of international, humanitarian, and human rights law. A Truth Out report on divesting from drone manufacturers explains. It states U.S. targeted killings arguably fit under the definition of crimes against humanity as defined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But how could this be? Obama is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Well, even Geir Lundestad, the former non-voting director of the Nobel Institute, wrote in his 2015 memoirs that awarding Obama the prize was only partially correct and did not achieve what the committee had hoped for. In announcing the deliberately vague and thus mostly useless guidelines on drone use in 2013, Obama said, "It is a hard fact that the U.S. strikes have resulted in civilian casualties, a risk that exists in every war. And for the families of those civilians, no words or legal construct can justify their loss." Of course, there is nothing that can soothe the pain of a grieving family, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. A good place to start might be in bringing an end to the program that's normalized targeted killings as a pillar of U.S. counter-terror policy and pushing harder for greater transparency and accountability. Hopefully, that change Obama promised is on the horizon. The Obama administration's war on whistleblowers was recognized by this year's Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. The NGO ranked the United States, the supposed paradigm of press freedoms, at a disturbing 41 out of 180 countries. Now, the timing of the release of the annual report, which highlighted the attack on our First Amendment, couldn't have come at a better time. As Obama wraps up his last few months in office, his administration will be remembered as the least transparent in U.S. history. That's right, Obama outbushed W by targeting and imprisoning more whistleblowers than all previous U.S. administrations combined. Bush's post-9/11 surveillance program to fight terrorism snaked its way into the lives of millions of innocent Americans in an effort to justify an ever-growing war machine. Now, whether it helped fight terrorism is debatable, but what's not is that it turned the United States into an overreaching surveillance state. Those who have sounded the alarm on instances of government overreach and information suppression, though, have been muzzled. Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, John Kiriakou, Thomas Drake. These are just a few examples of whistleblowers who are suffering under government censorship and oppression. Now, the White House makes it seem like these heroes who risked so much to expose the dirty, hidden workings in the bowels of our military and government aren't heroes at all, but traitors. And in doing so, the government forces other would-be whistleblowers to weigh their options carefully. Meanwhile, the corporate-owned mainstream media is all too happy to play along. Rather than act as a watchdog to government covering the contents of these leaks and questioning government motives, the media are acting nothing more than a lapdog, towing the official line and parroting government press releases, putting our First Amendment on life support. That's exactly why shows like this and other organizations like Project Censored exist, to explain how censorship has become a plutocratic cornerstone and why transparency is such a threat to the establishment is Mickey Huff, an expert on media literacy and director of Project Censored, a student-run media literacy effort which issues an annual report on the most important overlooked stories of the year. Check it out. Thank you so much, Mickey, for joining me today. The Obama administration has been described as waging an unprecedented war on whistleblowers. Why is our country so threatened by transparency?
Well, that's a great question, Mnar. And again, thank you for having me and for having Project Censored on your program. The Obama administration has really had an unprecedented attack on whistleblowers, on journalists. I don't mean unprecedented in the case that we have not seen these problems in American history before. We certainly have. But the attacks on whistleblowers has been quite significant. In fact, Obama has gone after more whistleblowers than any president, all the other presidents combined. We see assault on journalism, assault on access to halls of power. We see a relentless framing in corporate news media of stories. We see the problems of superdelegates in elections and the framing out of alternative parties. I would suggest that this is all part of a similar trend, that there is a fear of democracy. There's a fear of we the people having an actual say in government. And of course, when we know more and more about what our government is doing, we can have more significant say or more logical, rational, fact-based argument behind the things that we the people support and would like to see in our government. But again, back to the issue of the attack on whistleblowers, there's no shortage in government of leaks that come out when they are useful to the administration or the plutocratic establishment. So there's a very selective attacking of people that leak information. It's people like John Kiriakou who leak that the CIA is torturing people. It's Thomas Drake and NSA. It's Chelsea Manning and war crimes. Those are the things that the empire wants to conceal and hide because it doesn't jive with the rhetoric that we hear, the rhetoric of the endless campaign cycle about freedom. There is a fear of democracy, a fear of power, and that's why a couple years ago, Princeton and Northwestern universities did a study showing that the United States is in fact not a democratic society, does not have a Republican form of government even, and in fact we're an oligarchy governed by plutocrats. But I think that that's part of what's going on here with this administration, and I don't think that this is an Obama problem. This is a power problem. And this is a government, this is an empire. The United States has military bases all over the world. The military is involved in almost 3/4 of the world, and people really don't think about how that works or what that means. We're at war in over 7 countries. There's a lot of things that the government would rather people not know and not weigh in upon.
Right, and obviously, speaking of democracy, there's been sharp criticism of the media's infatuation of Donald Trump. I mean, he's giving advertisers a big bang for their buck, while alternative and third-party candidates can barely get mentioned in the media. How does this kind of media censorship serve the establishment during an election cycle?
Well, it serves the established powers quite well, and the people not at all. The bread and circus infotainment endless election cycle that we are enduring here, with people like Donald Trump, who is on Worldwide Wrestling one day and campaigning again the next. But even in the Democratic Party, we see amazing framing and control where the establishment is moving ever more toward Hillary Clinton and trying to marginalize the Bernie Sanders campaign in almost any way possible, including corporate media by not covering these campaigns, or when they do, there's a relentless framing where on MSNBC, Sanders was recently interviewed, and there was a discussion about, well, what did he think about Trump's attacks on Hillary, and then it was spun around to be, well, you're hurting Hillary's candidacy. The New York Times recently just ran a piece. Sanders overwhelmingly wins West Virginia. They basically say it's not a big deal, but more importantly, this is just prolonging the inevitable coronation of Hillary Clinton. That's framing. That's propaganda. That's not democracy. I mean, George Seldes once said that the role of journalism is to tell the people what's really going on, and that's not what they're doing here. And the corporate media don't do that. They function as a mouthpiece for the plutocracy. There is rampant forms of censorship afoot in American corporate media that involve omission, bias, framing, false dilemmas, various other fallacies, attacking, labeling. They're pretty commonplace. And one of the antidotes to that is education, critical media literacy, which we do at Project Censored. But this current cycle that we see, it's mind-boggling, actually. I fail to see how even everyday folks in this country don't see that this is happening. But again, when you have control of the messaging coming from so many quarters, it's easy for people to either be led astray or fooled by some of the messaging, or people just tune out. And when people tune out, it makes it easier for establishment candidates to win. By the way, there are other parties and alternative parties, and sadly, you have to go to Pacifica or even Russia Today, which recently held a third-party debate with libertarians, Green Party people involved, and so forth. I mean, the corporate news media want no part of that. They want no real part in having the public have decision-making in the election, which is also why the elections are rigged with superdelegates. There is election fraud. We saw another person being dismissed in Brooklyn over the 125,000 people being purged from roles there. I'm afraid that all of these things go back to the first question, and that's a fear of transparency, a fear of the multitude, and really a fear of democracy in this country by the establishment order.
Right, and I want to talk a little bit about WikiLeaks because WikiLeaks has been sharply critical of the handling of the Panama Papers, which exposed the tax havens of the rich and famous. Do journalists have an obligation to expose the contents of the leaks to the public?
Absolutely. They do, and it seems they are. Originally, you'll recall when these were leaked, the way in which the leak was used is, I believe, what's so suspect. It was mostly, the information was cherry-picked to criticize NATO enemies, basically, or U.S. enemies. I suppose as of late we're seeing more coming out from these Panama Papers that are implicating the Clintons, the Clinton Foundation. That's all very problematic. For that campaign. But it also means that we'd have to have a robust sense of journalism in this country that really goes out and covers those stories. I still do believe that there is an obligation among journalists and the citizenry, whether in the U.S. or globally, to question these sources. Hopefully we'll see more and more from the Panama Papers, but otherwise it's what some more suspect or critical of the process of making these documents available would call a limited hangout, right? And once again, I would suggest that that's because of the way in which those stories are framed, which stories get more attention than others and why. And again, we'll see. And again, from Julian Assange's perspective, who had a data dump, right, with what we saw through Chelsea Manning, I believe that that's the idea, right, is to make these things transparent and available. I understand the argument that, well, journalists need to vet these things and we need to be able to vet and see what the public is going to see. But that does add another layer of suspicion and potential censorship. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll learn more about what's going on among the powerful. I mean, certainly the offshore tax havens, maybe the details have not been so widely known, but this is not a new story by any stretch. I mean, we've known about these things for a very long time, and we've known that there have been various people involved. It turns out that those stories are merely corroborated by what we see in the Panama Papers. But we have to be very careful in an age where we have so many big in front of things. And when we say big, we mean corporate, we mean financial, we mean capitalistically driven, whether it's big pharma, big ag, big science, military industrial complex, the national security complex. There's reason for people to be suspect of what expert opinion may be, given that so many profits are involved in these kinds of decisions. I think we are in a quandary, Mnar. I don't think there's a quick fix or easy outs. What I would suggest is that the more transparent we are, now we're back to your first question again, the more transparent we are as a society and the more people are left to their own critical thinking devices to determine what this information means, I think the more just and democratic our society will eventually become.
Right. And Mickey, Project Censored is celebrating 40 years of fighting media censorship. In those 40 years, how has the landscape shifted and how has the fight changed? I mean, is it the same or has it really changed?
Well, we're certainly still in the fight against censorship. We believe censorship is anything that interferes with the free flow of information in a society that purports to have a free press system. That means, of course, it is things like outright omission or the blacking out of a story, but it's also framing. It's like I mentioned before, there are many, many ways that stories are skewed or underreported, propagandized in ways that really leave out the core facts of the matter at hand. We do now, of course, have access to much broader technology, and I think we do have access to a lot of information that we didn't have prior or that only a select few had prior in previous generations. But like any tool, it depends how it's used in terms of who it benefits. We're kind of awash in a sea of information in the 21st century in places like the United States, but we also seem to lack enough of critical thinking skills or discernment to really connect all the dots. We do need sometimes to have help connecting certain dots. Journalists are supposed to do some of that dot connecting, and I think a lot of great independent journalists do exactly that. But we can't really rely on a lot in the corporate media to do that, given that they have other masters to serve, shareholders, serving interests of those that are profiting. Les Moonves recently at CBS said people like Donald Trump are terrible for American politics, but they're great for corporate media. They're great for CBS. They're great for ratings. Well, that's one of the most honest admissions of a conflict of interest regarding the First Amendment I've heard, at least this year. It's pretty, again, remarkable. So at Project Censored, we don't just fight censorship and we don't just call out what we think is wrong with media. We also celebrate what we think is right. And we have we celebrate every year, literally hundreds of publications, programs, independent journalists, that are telling the stories that we think need to be told, that tell the stories that the public need to know about, to hold people that are in power accountable as much as possible. We ran through a litany of reasons why that's difficult to do, but it's necessary to do. And people cannot fight those fights against the powerful without access to information. A very important message here, and this is the thing that we're really promoting at Project Censored still 40 years later, is that no matter what your first issue is, your first concern in politics and society, if your second priority isn't media, isn't some kind of media reform or true media democracy movement, then you're likely to gain little traction in your first area of interest. We do that at Project Censored every year, and we do it through what we call critical media literacy education. And we really try to teach the next generation of people how to be intrepid independent journalists, how to be truth tellers, how to discern fact from opinion, and how to ask the right kind of questions. We're interested in trying to teach people how to think critically, not what to think. And there's a key difference there. It's very important in this day and age that we build bridges, and perhaps sometimes they're unlikely bridges, like the right-left divide, which I think is kind of a false paradigm in many ways. But there are many people that are marginalized from the current top-down plutocratic corporate system. And I think that if we, the people, are going to unite against such a system and have any real chance of changing it, then we really have to sit down and understand where the problems are and how we can best go about solving them. At Project Censored, we think one of those ways is through the antidote to this is through critical media literacy, real free press kind of journalism, having an intrepid free press that goes to the places and shines the light in dark places and asks the tough questions of people in power. But we don't see that in corporate news media. Even people like Chuck Todd over at NBC, have admitted, they've literally said these things in public, kind of like Les Moonves said, that, well, I can't ask people in power tough questions or they won't come back on my program, the problem of official sourcing, or we can't offend these advertisers or certain owners. That's a real problem. So instead of continuously trying to reform a system that's actually doing what it's designed to do, which is propagandize the public and maintain order in a plutocratic society, we need an alternative structure entirely. And at Project Censored, that's what we've long supported for 4 decades.
Right, and obviously today we had a big discussion about media literacy and censorship. Project Censored publishes a list of top censored stories each year, and we're obviously about halfway through 2016. So what's topping your list for this year so far? What do you think?
Well, it's timely that you ask. We're finishing the Censored 2017 book now, Andy Lee Roth and I, and we're working with well over a dozen campuses and professors and a few hundred students. We're reviewed over a couple hundred stories that we call validated independent news. Remember, this is a student project. It's an educational project, and we think that that's what gives it more legs or longevity. And we're trying to really walk the walk, so to speak, not just talk the talk. And the stories that we do every year have similar themes, right? For example, this year we definitely have stories on the list about the significance of big pharma lobbying, the U.S. military presence in most of the world, crisis and evidence-based medicine, for example, where we've seen a Lancet study showing that a quarter to half of studies may be flawed or are somehow skewed because of something that's going on behind the scenes. Global electronic waste and living in the wake of waste, nuclear power in Fukushima, a growing problem, not just in Japan, but in the United States and around the world. And of course, stories based on climate change issues and the challenges that we face, globally in this way. We've just seen a few islands in the Pacific pretty much disappear because of the rising sea levels. These are all real problems, but we don't just talk about the problems, Mnar. We also talk about solutions, and we highlight a lot of stories where people are really fighting back and they're really making some significant changes. So that's what we at Project Censored hope to do, is to not just focus on negative issues, but also focus on where are these things changing? Of course, one of our areas of focus is education, where we believe that we can help change things. But we also think that we need to have, again, really grassroots independent media, where people are going out, telling the stories, and sort of getting more and more attention to those that are moving and making positive strides for reimagining and rethinking the way that we live in the 21st century.
Well, thank you so much, Mickey Huff, Director of Project Censored. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure, Mnar. Keep up the great work.
Well, thanks again for joining me today. You can check me out on Facebook and on Twitter at Mnar, MUH, where I'll continue to go behind the headline. Until next week.